Hey friends, it's Laurie. Today I'm sharing some of my favorite Christmas and winter DIYs. To help keep the cost down, I used mostly Dollar Tree supplies and a few things that I had on hand. As always, I hope you have fun hanging out and crafting with me, so let's get busy. I'm starting my gingerbread house by using 2 of the Dollar Tree wooden cutouts. The top 2 windows on my houses had fallen off, so to make it easier to paint, I just removed the other 4. Now that I'm done, I'm using my white acrylic paint to paint both of the house's roofs and the accent pieces along with the windows. To give inside of the house a warm glow, I'm painting the window area with my yellow acrylic paint. And now to give them that warm gingerbread color, I'm using some of my brown acrylic paint. I didn't paint over the trees when I was painting because I wasn't sure if I was going to end up painting them green. I didn't end up painting them, and I actually found a better option to use when I was decorating the house. With the paint on my houses dry, I'm reattaching the windows using some E6000. I just added some to the back of each and reattached them in their original place. To accent the door, I'm using some of this pretty silver trim that I had on hand. I'm outlining both of the doors and attaching the trim with my E6000. With both doors complete, I found these wooden Christmas trees in a Dollar Tree sticker pack, and I'm painting all 4 of them green. Once they're dry, I'm then adding on some white paint accents here and there to kind of mimic snow. To add on the trees, I placed some hot glue on the tree outline and then attached them into place. To make the sides and the roof for my gingerbread house, I'm using 4 of these Dollar Tree wooden planks. To make the side walls, I laid one of the gingerbread houses upside down. I then used my pencil to mark the height of the wall on the house. I did this for both pieces and then cut them to size. For my roof, I'm using 2 of the planks full size along with some of the Dollar Tree clothespins. I need 36 separate pieces, so I'm pulling 18 of them apart. Now that I have them all separated, I'm going to attach them onto the planks. To attach the pieces onto the plank, I'm using my Starbond thick glue. I love it because it sets up super quick, and if you'd like to try it out yourself, I do have it linked below in my description. Holding the plank horizontally, I'm adding on some of my glue, then placing the flat side of the clothespin down, and then alternating the ends. As you're adding them, you'll start to see a pattern appear, and there'll be a little square in the center. I ended up using that as my guide as I was attaching them. After I completed one side of the roof, I then followed the same instructions and made the second. Using the same paint as I painted the house, I then painted the roof and the 2 sides. I'm attaching the roof first, and I'm adding a line of glue up near the top edge. Then, to give it a little more integrity, I'm following it up with a line of E6000. From there, I added the roof panel, and I kind of held it in place for a couple of seconds. I then added a line of hot glue onto the panel and the house. For my second piece, I followed the exact same instructions, making sure to butt the 2 pieces of the roof tightly together. I then finished up by adding another line of hot glue onto the side and in between the 2 top pieces. To add on the side pieces, I once again used my hot glue gun, E6000, and then attached the piece to the side. I then used my glue gun and added some hot glue to the inside. To add the second side panel, I followed the same instructions as the first. To add on the back piece of my gingerbread house, I'm following the same instructions with the hot glue and the E6000. With that complete, I'm placing the back part of the house onto the front. I'm going to be adding on some simple snow, and I'm just using some white acrylic paint. I placed a small amount on the end of a wet paintbrush, and then using a second paintbrush, I started tapping it onto my gingerbread house and the roof. It's a subtle effect, but this was my attempt at staying away from adding on the heavy snow and glitter. To accent the front and the back of my gingerbread house, I'm using 4 of these Dollar Tree candy canes. I'm also using 6 of the red and white striped straws, and these came from the Dollar Tree as well. I added on some hot glue to the gingerbread house and then attached the straws. They were a bit long for the sides, so I did cut 2 of them to fit. I'm gluing my candy canes onto the top by adding some hot glue and attaching them upside down. I'm also leaving a little space in between both of them. I painted one of the Dollar Tree candy cane wooden stickers, and I attached that to the top. To make the Christmas wreath for my gingerbread house, I'm using a small piece of this Dollar Tree greenery. It's wired, so I'm twisting it around in a tight circle. Then using my scissors, I'm just kind of trimming it up until it resembles a little mini wreath. To add on the Christmas bulbs to my wreath and gingerbread house, I'm cutting some of the individual beads off of my Mardi Gras beads. With them cut, I added some hot glue to my wreath and then just attached them around it. When I was done, I then hot glued it to the front of my gingerbread house door. To add some Christmas lights to my gingerbread house, I'm using the same beads. I'm placing on random dots of hot glue and then attaching the different colors. When the roof is complete, I'm then adding them across the front and down both of the sides. To finish up my Dollar Tree gingerbread house, I'm adding a peppermint candy onto each of the windows. To make the candy cane tree, I'm using about a half a roll of this red and white clothesline that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. For my tree, I'm using one of these 8-inch styrofoam cones, and I found this at Walmart. You can use the cones that they sell at Dollar Tree, but the top of them are flat, so I would suggest if you use it, just kind of cut away the sides so you turn it into a point. Wrapping the tree is super easy. All I did was add a dot of hot glue at the bottom, and then I started the clothesline. With my first piece attached, I'm making sure that I'm using my finger protector because you're going to get up close and personal with this hot glue, but I'm just adding hot glue and I'm attaching the clothesline, working my way around the bottom. I have my tree sitting on a piece of waxed paper, and I did this because just in case when I was starting the glue dripped, it wouldn't attach it to the brown paper underneath. As I'm adding on the hot glue, I'm attaching the clothesline and I'm trying to keep it as closely together as possible. When I found this clothesline at the Dollar Tree, it reminded me of candy canes, but they also have some green and white, which would make really cute trees, along with some blue and white. This is the easiest project ever, and all I'm doing is continuing adding the hot glue and wrapping the clothesline around my tree. To finish off the top, I add on some hot glue and I continue wrapping it around into a point. I cut off the clothesline and then hot glued the end down, and there's plenty of this clothesline to make at least 2 or 3 of these trees. Now that I'm done, I'm going to add a star on the top of my tree, and I'm using one of these wooden stars from the Dollar Tree. I'm keeping mine very simple, and I'm painting it with some white acrylic paint. And while I was painting it, I did make sure to paint it on both sides. With my star dry, I'm adding it onto the top of the tree by simply placing on a dot of hot glue. For the base or the trunk on my tree, I'm using a cap from a bottle of orange juice. I'm painting mine brown, and I'm using some of the Dollar Tree acrylic paint. When it's dry and I kind of think it looks like a cookie, I just placed some hot glue on the top and then centered my tree. Now that it's complete, this candy cane tree is the perfect complement to my gingerbread house. Getting started, I'm recycling a 4.5-inch round wooden circle. This originally was a topper to a candle, but you can always use a block of wood or something similar. For the tree post, I'm using one of these long, heavy-duty wooden skewers, and I had picked this up at the Dollar Tree. I'm then cutting it down 14.5 inches from the point. I drilled a hole in the center of the base and tapped in the flat end of my skewer. I'm making my tree 14 inches, and the 1/2 inch is inserted into the base, but you can make your tree any size you'd like. I'm using my white acrylic paint, and I'm giving the bottom base a coat. Now that it's dry, I'm going to cut the rope for my tree. For the tree's branches, I'm using 3 packages of the Dollar Tree's nautical rope jute. To get started, you're definitely going to need a sharp pair of scissors, and now I'm cutting 10 8-inch pieces of rope. With that complete, I'm now cutting 10 7-inch pieces of rope. My scissors were really sharp, but I noticed after I had cut all those pieces, I did have to go and sharpen them because they were getting dull, and on top of that, my hands were getting really tired. For my next group, I'm cutting 10 6-inch pieces of rope. I'm now cutting my 4-inch lengths of rope, and once again, I'm cutting 10 pieces. I'm now moving on, and to finish up, I'm cutting 8 3-inch lengths, 6 2-inch lengths, and 6 1-inch pieces. I'll be sure to list all these measurements below because it definitely can get confusing. Now that I have all my rope cut and it's organized in sizes, I'm going to be adding it onto the base, which is super easy. I'm turning the base away from me and I'm using the pointed end of the skewer. Now, if you're doing this yourself, you can do it while you're standing, but for my video, I'm going to have it lying down. I'm starting with my 8-inch pieces and I'm just kind of eyeballing the center of the rope, then sliding it down the skewer. While you're adding your rope, if you're a little off here and there with the center, not to worry because we're going to end up giving them all a trim. If you decide to make a tree that's a little taller or a little shorter, you may need to cut more or less pieces of rope, and you can always use my 14-inch tree as a guide. With all 10 pieces attached, I'm moving them around the bottom of the base and evenly spacing them. And then using my glue gun, I'm attaching a bit of hot glue to help hold them in place. I'm now adding my 7-inch lengths of rope, and because the rope was wrapped around each other, when it was cut, it does have a natural curve to it. I'm making sure that all curved ends are facing the same direction, so I'm placing mine with the curved ends downward. Now that I'm done, I'm evenly spacing them around my 8-inch pieces and adding some hot glue on to help hold them in place. I'm now adding on the 10 6-inch pieces of rope that I had cut. As you're adding the rope, you can see why it's so important to have that pointy end of the skewer on the top. If not, it would probably be almost impossible to add on the rope. Once I had all my 6-inch pieces attached, I then evenly spaced them around the bottom layer and once again added on some hot glue to help hold them in place. We're continuing to work our way up the tree, and I'm now adding on the 10 4-inch pieces. I once again evenly spaced them around the layers below and then added on some hot glue to help hold them in place. I'm now adding on my 8 pieces of 3-inch rope, and then once again, I'm just evenly spacing them around the top. I added on a dot of hot glue to help hold them in place, and now I'm adding on my 6 2-inch pieces. I followed the same instructions, evenly spacing them, and added on that dot of hot glue. We finally reached the top, and I'm adding on my 6 1-inch pieces of rope. But the difference is, as I'm adding them on, I'm evenly spacing each piece and then adding a dot of hot glue to help hold them in place. With all of my pieces of rope attached, I'm going to start fraying them. To do this, I'm unraveling the rope, but when I get near the center, I'm making sure that I keep at least 3/4 of an inch or so of rope on either side. And the reasons for doing this is because if you unravel the rope too closely to the middle skewer, it will just fall away from the tree. The 1-inch pieces at the top are all glued in place. Now that I'm done, it's definitely in need of a haircut, so I'm going to use my scissors and trim up all the branches. With my tree all trimmed up, I'm going to be adding on some color, but you can always choose to just leave this a rustic piece. I'm using my forest green acrylic paint, and with a paintbrush, I'm randomly painting the tops and the bottoms of my tree. I left enough of the brown color showing to give my pine tree a realistic appearance. And now, because this is a Christmas tree, I'm using some of my white acrylic paint, and I'm going to give it a snowy effect. I added some onto the end of my paintbrush and just started adding it on here and there. I had no set pattern. I added it onto the end of the branches and in between and up and under, and just kind of everywhere that I think snow might fall and land on a tree. Now that it's dry, I'm going to be adding on some Christmas ornaments, and this step is completely optional. I love using Mardi Gras beads because they're super inexpensive and they come in so many pretty colors. To make my Christmas ornaments, I'm just cutting separate beads off of the different colors. I didn't have any specific amount, but I think I ended up cutting about 30 to 40 individual beads. With them all cut, here comes the fun part. I'm adding them to the tree, and it's so easy. I'm just placing a dot of hot glue here and there on the branches and then just popping on a different colored bead. I continued adding them on until my tree was covered in different colored ornaments. For my tree's final accent, I'm adding on a double star, and I picked up these silver sparkly paper stars at Joann's and this assorted pack of stars at Michael's. I'm making 2 sets, one for each side of my tree. I just peeled off the backing of the gold star and centered it in the middle of the silver star. With both of them complete, I placed some hot glue on the top of the skewer and attached one star. I turned my tree over, added some more hot glue, and attached the second. With my 2 stars added, my rustic rope Christmas tree is complete. If you're new to my channel, please consider clicking on that little red subscribe button below and leaving me a thumbs up. And to all my returning friends, I love reading your comments and I'm always so happy to see you. I'm making my 'Tis the Season Christmas tree sign by using one of these 8x10 Dollar Tree frames. I'm taking it apart. I'm removing the little tabs that holds it in place, the backing and the paper insert, along with the glass. For my DIY, I'm using 3 acrylic paints, Christmas green, white, and a sage green. I'm painting my frame with my white acrylic paint, but you can choose any color you'd like. I'm putting that aside, and while it dries, I'm going to work on my glass pane. I'm using a paintbrush with a small, thin end, and I'm starting with my Christmas green paint. I'm starting on the side of my glass, making random strokes with the ends turning upwards. As I worked my way up the tree, I continued to make the branches just a bit shorter. As you're adding on the paint, don't be super fussy because we're going to be adding on multiple layers. I'm now adding on the sage green and I'm following the same instructions. After the green, I came in with my white acrylic paint and a much heavier stroke, and I also followed the same instructions. Now that I have my white added, I'm going to add in the sage green, and all I'm doing is adding some strokes in here and there, and if I see any clear glass, I'm trying to fill those in as well. As I'm adding each layer of paint, they begin to blend in with each other, and it gives my tree a more natural look. For the back of my sign, I'm adding on a piece of translucent paper. Mine has some sparkly accents that remind me of snow, but if you don't have any of this on hand, you can always use a piece of white paper. To attach it to the glass, I'm using a glue stick and I'm making sure to stay just at the edge of the paper. I'm making sure when I add the glue that it's no wider than the frame. When I'm done, I'm then adding my glass tree onto the paper, making sure that the edges match up perfectly. Once it's in place, I push down around the edges to make sure it's attached. Now that the frame has dried, I'm going to attach the two together using some of my E6000. I added a generous amount on the inside edge of the frame, then placed in my glass tree. I let it set up for about an hour and I printed out the words "'Tis the season" on my Cricut. If you don't have a Cricut, you can always use some stickers. I found its placement, added it onto my sign, and then I rummaged through my button jar looking for something I could use as ornaments. I found some green, red, and white buttons, and I arranged them on the tree. I'm happy with their placement, so I'm using my E6000 to attach them. Instead of buttons, you can always add on some Mardi Gras beads. You just cut them into individual pieces and glue them on. As the topper for my tree, I'm making a small bow, and I'm using some of this pretty Christmas ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I'm also adding a second bow as an accent, and I'm using some of this pretty red sheer ribbon, and this came from the Dollar Tree as well. I placed the two ends of the ribbons together and made a simple bow. I cut the tails at an angle, and now using my glue gun, I'm attaching it to the top of the tree onto the frame. This next step is completely optional. I'm using a green colored pencil and I'm following along the decorative line on the frame. By doing this, it breaks the white up just a bit and leaves a hint of green accent. For the hanger, I'm using a piece of red ribbon and I cut about an 18-inch piece. To attach it, I added some hot glue onto the back and also some E6000. The hot glue will hold it in place while the E6000 sets up. Now that it's complete, this will make a pretty addition to your holiday home, hanging on a wall or a window. I'm starting this DIY by using a block of wood that I found in my kindling bin. It originally was headed for the wood stove, but I'm going to turn it into a reindeer instead. It measures about 7 inches in height and 3.5 inches in width. It's not in the best condition. It's a little banged up and it has some rough spots, so I'm going to use this Dollar Tree sanding block and kind of clean it up just a bit. Now that pretty much most of the edges are smooth, I'm going to use some of the Dollar Tree brown acrylic paint and give it a complete coat. While that's aside and drying, I looked through my large bag full of wooden beads and knobs and all types of odds and ends, and I found this. I think it was a wooden knob that was cut in half. I'm going to use this for my reindeer's nose, but there are all types of different things you can use. You could always use one of the Dollar Tree cut wood pieces or one of their ping pong balls, and if you had a wooden pole on hand, that would work great too. Now that I have the reindeer's nose picked out, I'm going to paint it with this pretty red acrylic paint. Now that both of the pieces are dry, it's time to add on some accents. I'm giving my reindeer some really simple eyes, so I decided where I wanted the nose to be and turned the block of wood around. I used my pencil and then drew 2 ovals for the eyes. With those all set, I'm now using some of the Dollar Tree black acrylic paint and I'm filling them in. With the eyes dry, I'm adding on 2 little white dots using some white acrylic paint. I'm using the ends of 2 different paintbrushes and one is just a little bit bigger than the other. I dipped the larger into my white paint and then added a dot to each eye. Then using the smaller end of the other paintbrush, I dipped that in the paint and made a smaller dot under the other 2. I then used a thinner paintbrush and using my black acrylic paint, I gave her eyes 3 lashes. For her nose, I'm back to using my white paint and I'm just adding on a very tiny curve. I finished off the curve by adding 2 dots of white on each end and then I added 2 additional dots underneath it. To attach the 2 pieces together, I'm using my E6000. I'm adding some to the bottom of the knob and then attaching it under the eyes. Now that it's dry, I'm giving it a complete coat of Mod Podge. This step is completely optional. I just wanted to give mine a little bit of a sheen and I am using the satin Mod Podge. To add on the antlers, I went out into my yard and clipped off a couple of twigs from a bush. I shortened up the ends so that they would fit onto my deer and then using my hot glue, I just attached them in place. With my reindeer dry, I'm going to make it a little tuft of hair and I'm using some of the jute from the Dollar Tree. I'm making about 8 or 9 figure 8s with some 6-inch jute. When I'm done, I then cut the jute free from the roll. I wrapped it around the center of my bunch and then just made a couple of knots to hold it together. I then used my scissors to cut off the loops so that all the ends were hanging free. Now that I'm done, I have this little tuft of hair and to add it, I'm placing some hot glue in between the antlers and then just attaching it in place. To finish up, I'm giving my deer a bow and I'm using some of this 2.5-inch Christmas wired ribbon that I had on hand. I'm cutting a piece about 10 inches in length. I folded the ribbon in half to find the center and then folded both ends in and then using my glue gun, I hot glued them into place. I cut another piece of ribbon at about 3 inches. I then folded the striped sides in and attached them with my glue gun. I then pinched the middle of my ribbon together, wrapped around the polka dot short ribbon, and attached it in the back. When I was done, I opened up the loops and then using my glue gun, I attached it over the hair. And now that I'm done, this recycled cutie is ready for the holidays. Getting started, I'm using one of these 9 by 13 Dollar Tree signs, and you can use any kind at all because we'll be working on the back. I removed the hanger and the sticker, and I'll be reusing this hanger at the end of my project. I'm using this timeless gray acrylic paint, and it's basically a light gray, and I'm going to be giving my sign 2 coats. For the tree in my project, I'm using this wired garland from the Dollar Tree, and I'll be using 6 pieces of the greenery. I'm using one for the base of my tree, and then the other 5 I'll turn into branches. I'm going to be using half pieces, so I'm folding each one in half and then snipping off at the fold. I have 10 pieces in total, and I'm actually only going to be using 9. To make the branches, I'm using one of the half pieces of greenery. I'm placing it about an inch up from the bottom against the stem, then wrapping one side around the stem and then the other. From there, I'm measuring up about an inch and adding on my next branch, placing it on the front and then wrapping one side around and then the other. From there, I'm just continuing on adding the branches, and I'm just kind of eyeballing it about an inch between each. And if you find that you have a little bit too much space or not enough, just untwist them and move them around. When I'm adding on the last branch, I'm once again leaving just about an inch on the top of the tree. Now that I'm done, because the branches are actually going sideways and not top to bottom, they're a little messy. So I'm just going to use my scissors and clean them up. I'm not going to cut them too short, but just enough to kind of get those long ends and make everything look neat. Now that it's all tidied up, I'm going to bend each of the branches down at an angle. Now that I'm done, I'm going to find the placement of the tree on my sign. And for the trunk, I'm using one of these little cut pieces of wood from the Dollar Tree. They come in a bag, and there's usually about 10 or 12 in there. To attach it, I'm using my glue gun and making sure that the bottom of the trunk sits flush with the bottom of my sign. I'm now adding some hot glue to the back of the tree, leaving about 2 inches from the top without glue. I'm then attaching it to the sign and making sure the bottom is centered on the trunk. Once in place, because the top part of my tree is not attached, I'm just slightly bending it over. As the snowman accent on my tree, I'm using these 2 from the Dollar Tree. One has a little black top hat and the other one has a red knit hat. When I looked at these 2, the smiles are a little off and kind of messy, so I'm just going to use some of my white acrylic paint and clean them up. With the paint dry, they both look so much happier, and now I'm going to gently remove their arms. I'm attaching my first snowman, and I'm using the one with the red knit cap. I'm using my glue gun to attach him and making sure that the bottom of his body matches up with the top of the tree trunk. As soon as that snowman has set up, I'm adding on my second, and I'm placing him down on the first snowman's head and kind of at an angle on his side. Now to attach him permanently, I'm adding some hot glue to his side and attaching him at an angle. To add the arms onto my top snowman, I'm adding some hot glue to the end and then tucking it under the scarf and having it standing up against the tree. To add on the second arm, I'm placing some hot glue on the end and tucking it into his scarf, having it facing upwards. For my bottom snowman's arms, I'm once again placing on some hot glue and then tucking the outside one just under his scarf. For the inside arm, I'm once again adding on some hot glue and attaching it across from the outside arm. I'm adding a snowy accent onto the tree, and I'm using my white acrylic paint. I added some to the end of my paintbrush, and I'm painting it on the branches here and there, and you can add as much or as little as you'd like. I'm adding on some snow, and I'm using a handful of polyfill. If you don't have any of this on hand, you can always use some cotton balls. I'm placing it down around the bottom and just kind of adding it around the tree and the base of the snowman. Then using my hot glue gun, I'm attaching it all in place. Now that it's attached in place, I'm using my scissors to trim up the bottom and the sides, but if you like it kind of fluffy, you can just leave it as is. The snowman's going to be adding a star to the top of the tree, and I'm using one of these small wooden stars from the Dollar Tree. I'm painting mine gold using my gold acrylic paint, but you can choose any color you'd like. Now that it's dry, I'm adding some hot glue to the end of the snowman's hand and the end of my tree, and then just attaching the star in place. I'm adding on a snowflake accent, and I'm using 3 of these wooden snowflakes from the Dollar Tree. I'm using my white acrylic paint, and I'm giving the front of each a coat. This next step is completely optional. In the center of each snowflake, there's a little hole, and I want to cover it up, so I'm going to use just 3 small diamonds from this Dollar Tree diamond wrap. I cut 3 away from the roll, added a dot of hot glue in the center of each snowflake, and then just placed in the diamond. Even though I'm only adding 1 diamond in the center of each snowflake, when the light hits them just right, it gives them that little bit of sparkle. I'm finding the snowflakes placement on my sign, then using my glue gun to attach them. I'm turning my tree into a Christmas tree, and I'm using an assorted bunch of Mardi Gras beads that I had on hand. To make the Christmas ornaments, I just used my scissors to cut a bunch of them free from the different colored strands. Now that I have my ornaments cut, attaching them to the tree is super easy. I'm just adding some random dots of glue here and there and placing on the different colored beads. Decorating the tree is so fun. You can always customize the colors you use. You can add just a few, or if you're someone like me, I'm just loading mine up. With all the ornaments in place, the last thing that's left to do is to attach the original red hanger onto my sign. And with that, my snowmen and their Christmas tree sign is ready to hang. I'm starting by using one of these fluffy dust mops from the Dollar Tree. To remove the handle, I just twisted it off the end. With that complete, I'm placing it aside to make Santa's boots. I'm using one of these cute little boot ornaments that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I'm removing the little pom-pom accents, and I'm going to hang on to those because sometime in the future I'll probably end up using them. Now, using my scissors, I'm going to carefully remove the white faux fur from the top of each boot. I'm not going to be using the bottom part, so if you have to sacrifice a bit of that, not to worry. I removed the bottom and the glue that held on the top. It came off pretty easily. When I was done, I then followed the same instructions for the second boot. each of the boots have a seam, so I'm using a light grit sandpaper and lightly sanding them down. I wiped off the sanded residue, and now using my black acrylic paint, I'm giving them each a coat. Now that they're dry, I'm going to attach the faux fur rings back on the top. I placed it back over the boot and then used my glue gun to attach it in place. After the first boot was complete, I followed the same instructions for the second. When you're adding it back on, don't worry if it's not perfect because honestly, you're not even going to see most of it. With both of them complete, I'm adding some hot glue to the top front to attach them together. On the opposite end of the dust mop, from where I removed the handle, there is a small capped end. To attach the duster, I'm adding some hot glue in the center of the boots, between the fur and placing the end down to meet the bottom fur on the boots. To give my Santa some weight so he can stand on his own, I'm using some of these glass beads that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I pushed as many as I could down into his boots, and you can always use anything you have on hand. Now that he's balanced and stands on his own, I'm removing the top metal piece that attached the handle. To give my Santa just a bit more support, I'm using 2 of the 6-inch wooden dowels that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. To help them blend into Santa's beard, I gave each of them a coat of white acrylic paint. To attach them, I'm placing one in the back of each of Santa's boots and making sure that they touch the bottom. I'm then adding some hot glue between the dowel and the boot to hold them in place. I'm now pulling away the beard and adding a dot of hot glue to the dowel, and then I'm hiding it back into the beard. When I was done, I then followed the same instructions for the other side. To add on Santa's hat and his arms, I'm using one of the red sparkly Christmas tree skirts that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. To make Santa's hat, I'm giving myself enough room on the side of the skirt, placing the top at the top of his head, and then wrapping it around. I'm making sure I have enough fabric to cover his head, and I'm basically cutting the skirt in half. Before I add it, I need to make his nose, so I'm using one of these table tennis balls from the Dollar Tree. I'm painting mine with some coral acrylic paint, and to make it easier to paint, I'm placing one of the Dollar Tree wooden skewers into the side of the ball. Once it's dry, because it is paint on plastic, it can scrape off, so I'm giving mine a coat of Mod Podge to help protect the finish. When it was dry, I added some hot glue to the center of the beard 5 inches up from the bottom of the boots. I then pushed Santa's nose in place. I have my Santa upside down so you can see where I'm placing some hot glue on the top of his nose. To attach his hat, I'm first centering the fabric and placing the white end of the fur on his nose. I now folded down the top, added some hot glue, and then attached that to the top of the head. I'm now gathering the fabric in my hands and I'm bending the top slightly to the side. I'll be using one of these Dollar Tree dust cloths, but first I'm turning Santa over and I'm using it to protect his nose. I'm adding some hot glue along the top edge of the faux fur and I'm folding it in half. And now I'm doing the same for the other side. I'm attaching some hot glue to the back of Santa's head and then attaching my first folded side. I'm going to make an almost point at the top of Santa's hat. I folded it over and then hot glued it to the other side of Santa's hat. I'm now adding hot glue as I'm working my way down, and I'm pulling one side of the hat tightly onto the other, but not too tightly. You want to make sure that the front of Santa's face isn't constricted by how tight the hat is. And if you're not sure, before you glue it together, just kind of play with it so you're comfortable when you glue it. And as you can see, I also used my finger protector just to help prevent getting burned. To make Santa's arms, I'm using the other side of the tree skirt. I'm turning it over and folding one side about an inch worth of fabric. Now using my glue gun, I'm attaching the folded piece to the other side. I'm now adding on some more hot glue and folding my fabric onto that. I'm now giving myself about a 1/2 inch edge and cutting it free from the tree skirt. I'm adding a line of hot glue down the middle of the arm and folding the edge of my fabric onto it. With this one complete, I follow the same instructions and make my second arm. I used my scissors and I cut off those pointy ends. To attach them onto my Santa, I placed some hot glue on the top part of the arm and then tucked it up under the side of Santa's hat. I attached Santa's right arm the same way, but I let it hang just a bit lower than his left. My Santa's going to be holding a little gift box, and I'm using one of the gold presents from the Dollar Tree. I used some hot glue to attach the gift to his arm and to his beard. You can always leave his hat as is, but for me, I wanted to make it a bit fluffier, so I'm using that Dollar Tree dusting mop pad. There are seam lines in the back, and I'm going to cut along 2 of those, one completely and one halfway. One piece won't wrap completely around Santa's hat, so I'm going to end up using a piece and a half. Attaching them is super easy. I added some hot glue onto the white of Santa's hat, and then I centered and placed down the white fur. I added some hot glue onto the sides and the back, and then I attached my second piece. To accent Santa's hat, I'm using a piece of holly on a red ribbon, and this came off a Dollar Tree pick, but you can use any type of holly that you like. To attach it, I placed a dot of hot glue onto his hat and then just placed down the holly. To finish off Santa's hat, I'm using a white pom-pom that I already had on hand, but if you don't have any, a cotton ball will do the trick. Then I simply attached it in place with some hot glue. I was looking at Santa's boots and they looked a bit dull to me, so I ended up giving both of them a coat of my Mod Podge. When they were dry, they were nice and shiny, and now this Santa is ready for the holidays. Getting started, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree signs, and mine measures 9.5 by 13.5 inches. But if you're making this project, you can always use one a little bigger or a little smaller, and I'll be working on the back. I'll be adding a different hanger, so I'm removing this one from the sign. I'm going to make a snowman's head in the bottom corner of my sign, and to do this, I'm using a dinner plate. I decided how big I wanted my snowman's face to be and then followed the shape of the plate with a pencil. I'm now using some gray acrylic paint and painting the background of my sign. With that complete, I'm now using my white acrylic paint and I'm filling in the area that will become the snowman's head. With that complete, I'm now using the same pencil and I'm outlining the shape of my snowman's head. I'm just kind of sketching out the shape and then using my finger to smudge it, and it ends up giving it a nice smoky edge. When I'm done, I then use my pencil and work my way around the outside edge, and once again I'm just smudging it in with my fingers. To make the snowman's nose, I'm using a large craft stick. If you don't have any of these on hand, you can always use a piece of cardboard. I measured and marked mine at 6 inches. Then on the end that I had marked, I drew a long, thin triangle. Because this wood is fairly thin, I then used my scissors to cut out the shape. The sides were a bit sharp where I cut them out, so I just used a piece of sandpaper and sanded them down till they were smooth, and then I rounded the two ends at the bottom of the stick. With that complete, I'm using some of the Dollar Tree's orange acrylic paint, and I'm giving it a coat on one side. Once it's dry, I'm using my pencil and just making some lines randomly here and there like you might see on a real carrot. When I'm done, I then smudge the marks with my fingers. I then use my pencil and work my way around the outside edge, and I smudge that as well. I'm using 2 small wooden circles for the snowman's eyes, and I picked this pack up at Michael's. I used some of the Dollar Tree black acrylic paint and I gave them both a coat. With the carrot nose and the 2 eyes complete, I'm finding their placement on the snowman's face. I'm now using my E6000 to attach them permanently in place. I added some to the back of the carrot, attached that in place, and then because my tube has a wide opening, I just used the end of a wooden skewer and attached that to the back of the eyes, and then attached those in place as well. I'm adding a snow accent to my picture, and I placed some of the same white acrylic paint on the end of a paintbrush, and now with another paintbrush, I'm just tapping it all over the picture. This is a splattering effect, and I do this on a lot of my projects. I love it because you really can't mess it up. You're just kind of tapping the paint here and there, and it just goes wherever it wants. I picked up the wooden word believe at the Dollar Tree, and it came in a 2-pack. I'm using some red acrylic paint, and I'm giving the front a coat. I let it dry, and then using my E6000, I placed some on the back. I then attached it and centered it on the top of my sign. I'm adding on some snowflakes, and I'm using 4 of these silver and 4 of these wooden snowflakes that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I used my white acrylic paint and I painted all 4 of the wooden snowflakes. With the snowflakes dry, I'm adding my white and my silver together, and once again I'm using my E6000. I placed some on the end of the skewer and then attached the 2 together. This next step is completely optional. I have a box of crystals and I had picked these up a while ago at Michael's. I'm going to attach one in the center of each snowflake. I once again used the skewer and added some E6000 to the center of each snowflake and then attached the crystals. I gave them some time to set up, and now I'm adding some E6000 to the back of each snowflake, and then I'm randomly placing them on my sign. I'm giving my sign a white ribbon hanger, and I just pushed it through the 2 front holes and tied knots in the back. I'm giving my snowman a fleece scarf, and I found this one at the Dollar Tree. I placed it on the sign and gave myself about a 4 to 5 inch overhang. And then I cut about 2 inches wider than the sign. I have my cut fabric and I cut about a 6-inch length of the same ribbon that I used for the hanger. I gathered the fabric together at about the 4 to 5 inch mark and then tied it off with my ribbon. I added some hot glue on my snowman's neck and attached the gathered end there. I slightly folded over the bottom and attached that with my hot glue and then did the same to the top. I then hot glued the end of the scarf on the back of my sign. Using my scissors, I'm cutting up the middle of the overhanging fabric. I'm now using my glue gun to attach the 2 ends and folding them into the center. With that complete, I'm adding a little pom-pom that I had on hand into the center of the gathered fabric, and I just used my hot glue gun. And with that, my snowman picture is complete. To start my Christmas gingerbread recipe frame, I'm using one of the wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree. I removed the jute hanger and now I'm painting it with some brown acrylic paint. I'm not sure if it was the wood or my paint, but I did end up giving it 2 coats. Now that it's dry, I'm using some red acrylic paint and painting the accents on the arms and the legs. Now that those are painted and dry, I'm using some green acrylic paint and I'm going to paint over the 2 buttons. And to finish up the bow tie, I used some of my white acrylic paint. With the paint dry, I'm using my white paint pen and I'm making some accent lines on the arms and the legs. Mine kind of resemble a V, and when I'm done, I'm then adding 3 dots on the top and 2 dots on the bottom. These are the patterns that I chose to use, but just change it up and use anything that you'd like. I'm adding some accents to the bow tie and I'm using my red paint pen. You can always use a red permanent marker or even some paint. And I'm just adding on some diagonal lines. This next step is completely optional. I did dig a red and 2 green buttons out of my button jar. I then used my glue gun and I added the red onto the bow tie and then the green to cover the green buttons. I'm adding on a simple face and I'm starting with a round nose about a little less than halfway down in the center. Then underneath, I'm adding on a small half-circle smile. Above the nose, I'm then adding on 2 ovals for the eyes. With the face sketched out in pencil, I'm now using my black paint pen and I'm going to outline the eyes and then fill them in. Now that they're dry, I'm going to use my white paint pen again, and you can always use a marker or even paint, and I'm making a half circle on the outside of each eye. I'm now using the end of a paintbrush that I dipped in acrylic paint and adding a dot of white into each eye. Now that I'm done, I'm going to paint the nose with this dark cherry acrylic paint. I then followed the pencil lines on the mouth with my black paint pen, and I made 2 little dash marks above the eyes for eyebrows. You all know I love that splatter technique, so I have some white acrylic paint with a wet paintbrush. I'm now taking a second paintbrush and just tapping the paint all over the gingerbread man. All the steps that I'm doing on this gingerbread are completely optional. You can always change things up to make it your own. For the ends of the gingerbread's mouth, I'm adding on some little heart accents. I found these pink resin heart stickers at the Dollar Tree, and I'm attaching them using some E6000. With everything in place, I'm now using my satin Mod Podge and giving it a complete coat. To cover the hanger hole that's on the top, I'm going to add on a little ribbon accent. I'm using the green and red gingham ribbon along with some holiday stripe ribbon that came from the Dollar Tree. And I'm also using some white lace ribbon that I had on hand. I cut a 4-inch piece from each ribbon and then 3 4-inch pieces from the white lace. The ribbons are small, but I did dovetail each of their ends, and that's super easy. You just fold the ribbon in half and cut away the end at an angle. And I only did this for the ribbon ends. I then layered my ribbons with a piece of white between each. I used the last piece of lace to tie around the center of my ribbon bunch and to hold it into place. I added some hot glue over the hang tag hole and attached my ribbons. I'm accenting this project using 3 plastic candy canes that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I placed one onto the gingerbread and then hot glued it in place. I picked this wooden 4x6 frame up at Michael's and it cost me 99 cents. I removed the cardboard insert and I'm going to be using that later. To cover it, I'm using a pretty red and white striped piece of scrapbooking paper. I measured a little bit larger than the size of the frame and then cut out the paper. To attach the 2 pieces together, I'm using my Mod Podge. I placed a generous amount of it on the front of the frame and then centered my striped paper. Now that it's completely dry, I'm using a straight blade, and you can use an X-Acto or anything that you're comfortable working with, and I'm going to cut the excess paper on the outsides and the inside. Now that I'm done, I'm going to accent the frame, and I'm using the same red and green gingham ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I cut 2 green pieces of ribbon to wrap around the length of the longer side and 2 red for the shorter side. I then attached all 4 pieces using my hot glue gun. Now that my frame's complete, I'm going to add in this gingerbread cookie recipe. I made it on Canva and I'll link it below in case you'd like to use it for your project. I added it to my frame and then used the original insert to give it a little extra support. With the frame complete, I can now add my gingerbread, and I'm just kind of placing it at a bit of an angle on the side of the frame. I'm then using my glue gun to attach it. With that in place, I'm adding on the 2 extra candy canes, hot gluing one on the top and one on the bottom. Now that it's done, you can always lean this up against a wall or a tiered tray. I'm going to add on a hanger, and I'm just using a piece of the Dollar Tree jute. I cut about an 18-inch piece and added it onto the back using my hot glue gun. Once I had it in place, I did add on a little piece of the red gingham just to kind of help give it a little extra support. Now that I'm done, my Christmas gingerbread recipe frame is ready to help me make some cookies. I'm starting my sock snowman by using one of these white men's sports socks from the Dollar Tree. To give him some weight and to balance him, I'm using some of these bath salts, and I picked these up at the Dollar Tree as well. I found the easiest way to fill it is to place the end of the sock over the mouth of the jar. To fill out the head section, I'm using a handful of polyfill. I'm placing it inside and on top of the bath salts. With that in place, I'm now using a rubber band and I'm tying off the top of the sock. I'm now using my scissors and I'm cutting down the center of the top sock and making sure that I don't cut low enough to hit the rubber band. I'm now making 2 tight knots with the fabric and then cutting off the extra ends. To give my snowman a shape, I'm now using another rubber band and I'm placing it over the area in between where the polyfill meets the bath salts. For the snowman's hat and sweater, I'm using a pair of fuzzy women's socks and I picked these up at the Dollar Tree. I'm only using one, and to make the hat, I'm cutting it just below the heel. Now that I have it cut, I'm going to turn it inside out. To give my hat a little hem, I'm adding some hot glue about a ½ inch from the end, and I'm just folding it over. When one side was complete, I then finished up on the other. After the glue cooled, I then turned the hat back to the right side. To add it, it's now as easy as just slipping it over the snowman's head. To make the pom-pom, I'm using a piece of white ribbon and I'm wrapping it around the top of the hat where the white separates from the blue, and I'm just tying it into a knot and making the little pom-pom. By tying those knots on the top of the snowman's head, this fills out the area to make the pom-pom. I'm using my hot glue gun and I'm adding some under the hat and working my way around to attach it to his head. With that complete, we're now going to add on his sweater, and I'm using the rest of the sock. I'm sliding the uncut end of the sock up and over the snowman and stopping at his neck. I'm now evenly folding the cut ends up and under the sock. And now, just like the hat, I'm using my glue gun and hot gluing the sock to the body. I'm adding some buttons onto my snowman, and I went through my button jar and I found 2 small black buttons for his eyes and 2 silver for the buttons on his sweater. For the carrot nose, I'm folding the end of an orange pipe cleaner and then I'm twisting it and snipping it off. To add the eyes, buttons, and nose to my snowman, I just hot glued each in place. When making this snowman, I added in those scented bath salts, so he's not only just cute to look at, but he smells really good too. For his scarf, you can add on some fabric or cord. I'm using a pretty piece of snowflake ribbon that I had on hand. Mine is 2.5 inch, so to make it a little smaller, I folded both sides into the center. I then wrapped it around his neck and cut it to size. I then tied the ribbon around his neck and hot glued the two pieces together. To give the ends a more finished look, I dovetailed them, which is super easy. I just folded those ends in half and cut away at an angle. As a finishing accent, I'm using one of these wooden snowflake stickers from the Dollar Tree, and I painted mine with some white acrylic paint. I'm using my glue gun and attaching it to the center of the snowman's hat. To give the snowflake a little sparkle, I'm using one of these small crystal jewels, and I picked this box up at Michael's. I once again used my glue gun and attached it in the center of the snowflake. To finish up, I placed some pink blush on the end of a cotton swab and made two little cheeks on his face. And with that, this little snowman is complete. To start my Christmas bell house, I'm using one of these wooden houses from the Dollar Tree. They usually have a little LED light in the back, but mine didn't come with one. That's just as well because I'm going to be covering both sides with a piece of leftover scrapbooking paper. Mine is a Christmas pattern, but you can use any pattern you'd like. I traced the house on my paper 2 times and then I cut it out. To attach my pieces to both sides of the house, I'm using a glue stick. I'm adding a generous amount to the front and the back, and then I'm just attaching my scrapbooking paper. Finding one of these houses without the little LED light in the back actually worked out to my benefit. I'm making a roof and sides for my house, and I'm using some of the wooden clothespins from the Dollar Tree. I need 20 pieces for the roof, so I'm taking apart 10 of the clothespins. When I have them all pulled apart, I'm now going to make 4 sections with 5 pieces, making sure to match up the tops and the bottoms. I'm using my Starbond thick glue to attach the pieces together. I'm adding some to the side of each, and this glue sets up super quick. If you'd like to give it a try, I do have it linked below in my description. I continued adding on the glue until I had 4 separate sections with 5 pieces. While those are drying, I'm now going to use 3 wooden clothespins to make the sides for my house. I pulled them apart and I'm going to have 2 sections, each with 3 pieces, and once again I just followed the same instructions and attached them together with my Starbond thick glue. With my 4 roof pieces dry, I'm now attaching them together. I'm attaching my 2 flat ends together, making sure they meet at the raised wood. Now that the roof and the sides have set up, I'm using my white acrylic paint and I'm giving the roof a coat on both sides and the sides just a coat on the outside. Now that they're dry, I want to give them a bit of a rustic appearance, so I'm using my sanding block and I'm just sanding away a bit on the top and the sides. Now that all 4 pieces are distressed, I'm going to add them onto the house. I'm first adding the two sides using my hot glue gun and placing the flat end of the side onto the support and making sure that it is flush bottom with the house. To add on the roof, I'm making sure that the two thicker pieces of the roof are on the top. I then added some hot glue along the roof line and attached the two pieces. I made sure that both of them met together tightly at the top. For the bell accent on my house, I'm using one of these Christmas bell garlands from the Dollar Tree. They're all attached together on a string, so I just used my scissors and cut them free. And once I did that, the little gold toppers, they just fell right off of the bell. I need them flat to attach them to the house, so because the bells have a little raised end, I'm just pressing that down on the table and flattening them out. For the tree's trunk, I just went outside and picked up a little branch and I cut it at about 3/4 of an inch. I'm using one of the Dollar Tree wooden stars for the star on my Christmas tree and I'm painting it with my gold acrylic paint. With the star dry, it's now time to attach the pieces to the house. I'm first finding the placement of the bells and the trunk on my tree. And when I'm happy with them, I'm then using my hot glue gun and attaching them all in place. I always like to do this first because once you add the glue, it's permanent, and if you're not really happy, then it's like you're trying to take it apart. So that's why I always like to find my placement first. To finish up, I hot glued the gold star in the center of my tree. And with that, this Christmas bell house is ready for my tiered tray. To start my DIY, I'm using 3 of the wooden trees from the Dollar Tree. I'm also using 3 tumbling tower blocks, and these are from the Dollar Tree as well. Using my Starbond thick glue, I'm attaching a block to the back of each of the trees. And I'm leaving about 1/2 inch of block extending down past the trunk. After my first one is attached, I'm then attaching the next 2. I'm making all 3 of mine white, and I'm painting them with some white acrylic paint. With the white paint dry, I'm using some of my golden brown acrylic paint, and I'm painting each of the trunks. With those dry, I'm using my pencil and I'm rubbing the edges of it around the outside of the trees. When I'm done, I'm then rubbing my fingers around the outside of the tree and kind of rubbing in the pencil mark, and this lends a nice smoky appearance. For the tree's base, I'm using a wooden shelf display from the Dollar Tree. Mine measures about 13.5 by 5.5 inches, and if you can't find one of these, you can always cut down or use one of the Dollar Tree signs. I'm giving mine a gray background, so I'm painting it with some of my gray acrylic paint. I'm adding some lines by placing my ruler on the edge and marking it with my pencil. I placed my ruler against that line, and I ended up making a total of 3. I then ran my pencil on the outside edges and rubbed it with my finger to give that smoky accent. When I was done with the outside, I then worked my way on the inside, and I just ran my fingers up and down my pencil lines. And now that I'm done, my sign has a bit of a 3D effect. To line up my trees, I'm first finding their placement by lining up the largest branch on the outside edge of the sign and the trunk on the bottom. By doing this, you'll cover the pre-drilled holes, and then I just centered my last tree in the middle. I then used my glue gun to attach them in place. For the bows, I'm using some red buffalo check ribbon. It's 1.5 inch and it's wired. And I'm also using some black and white buffalo check ribbon. It's also 1.5 inches and wired. I'm making 3 simple bows, 2 out of the red buffalo check and 1 out of the black and white. When I had the tails the length that I wanted, I then dovetailed the ends. It's super easy. You just fold the ribbon in half and then cut away the end at an angle. I'm now making my second red ribbon and then my black and white and dovetailing both of their ends as well. These are the colors that I picked for my project, but you can always change them up to match your home decor. With all 3 of my bows complete, I'm adding them to the sign by placing some hot glue on the top of each tree. To add the hanger, I cut an 18-inch piece of the Dollar Tree jute. I'm using some medium-sized beads that I already had on hand, and I'm stringing 20 onto the jute. To make them easier to string, I did wrap a small piece of clear tape around the end of my jute. I then strung on the beads one by one. With all 20 beads strung on my jute, I'm turning my sign over and attaching the 2 ends onto the sign. Once I have the jute end attached, I'm just using a small piece of the ribbon and placing it over there to give it a little extra strength. Now that I'm done, my farmhouse Christmas trees are ready to hang. To make my joy wreath sign, I'm using 3 of the small foam dice from the Dollar Tree, and I found these in the party department. I'm going to be painting them, and to make it less messy, I'm using 3 wooden skewers. These came from the Dollar Tree as well, and I'm poking 1 into the bottom of each of them. I'm painting 2 of them red and 1 white using my acrylic paints. I ended up giving them each 2 coats, and the strange thing was I thought that the red dice would maybe be covered with 1 coat, but that was actually the hardest dice to cover. When my 2 red dice were painted, I then painted the white. Now that they're completely dried, I'm going to be attaching all 3 of them together. I'm attaching them together using my hot glue gun, and I'm adding some hot glue onto the side with the hole where I had attached the skewer. I placed some on the red, added on the white, and then added on my last red block. I need the letter J and Y for my project, and I'm using some of the Dollar Tree wooden letters. I used the same white acrylic paint that I had used for my block, and I gave both of them a coat. While those are drying, I'm going to make a small wreath for the center of my sign, and I'm using some of this wired garland greenery from the Dollar Tree. I'm using the leftover foam dice as my guide, and all I'm doing is wrapping one end of the greenery into a circle. I checked the size against the dice to make sure it fit, And then using my clippers, I clipped off the excess greenery. To keep my circle together, I then just wrap the two ends of the greenery around each other. I then once again check the size against the dice. To make it look more like a wreath, I used my scissors and clipped around the outside and the inside to make an opening. To decorate the wreath, I'm using some assorted Mardi Gras beads, and I love using these because they're inexpensive and they look like little ornaments. I used my scissors and clipped some single beads off of the strands. I'm adding on assorted colors, and to attach them, I'm just placing some dots of glue around the wreath and placing on the beads. If you don't have any Mardi Gras beads or small beads on hand, you can always use some thin ribbon and make a small bow and add that on instead. With my wreath complete, it's now time to add it and the letters onto the blocks. To attach them, I added some hot glue on the back of my letters and centered them on the red blocks. I then added some hot glue onto the back of the wreath and attached that in the center. I'm making a bow for my sign, and I'm using some of this pretty Christmas ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I made a simple bow and then cut the tails off at an angle. I added it to the top of the blocks by simply placing on a dot of hot glue. And now my joy sign that works perfectly on a tiered tray is complete. To make my ribbon Christmas tree, I'm using one of the green trees from the Dollar Tree. It does come with 3 pieces you can use as a stand, but I don't need them for this project. There's not a whole lot to them, so I gently spread out the limbs. I'm going to give them each a bit of a snowy accent, so I'm using some of my white acrylic paint. I placed some on the end of my paintbrush and began to add it on randomly here and there. If you add a little bit too much in one spot, just kind of move it around, and honestly, once the tree's all put together, you won't even notice. Once I had the front complete, I then turned it over and did the same on the back. While that's drying, I'm going to be cutting the ribbons for my tree. I'm using some of this 1.5-inch wired Merry Christmas ribbon from the Dollar Tree, a piece of Christmas stripe, poinsettia and share red ribbon 5/8 inch from the Dollar Tree. These next ribbons I had on hand a 1-inch white sheer ribbon, along with a 1-inch Christmas plaid ribbon. I'm using 2 wired ribbons, both 1.5 inches. One is a sparkly silver and the other is a red and white polka dot. And to finish up, I'm using this 1/2 inch silver trim. I'm cutting all the ribbon and trim, 2 pieces at 12 inches and 2 pieces at 14 inches. For the red and white polka dot, I cut 2 14-inch pieces and 3 12-inch pieces. What I love about this project is you can use different styles and different sizes of ribbon. I'm cutting the Christmas striped ribbon 2 at 12 inches, and I'm only using 1 of the red sheer ribbon, and I'm cutting that at 12 inches as well. For the poinsettia, I'm using 1 12 and 2 14-inch pieces. I'll list the ribbon and the sizes that I used below in my description. Now that I have them all cut, I'm going to dovetail the ends, and this is super easy. You just fold the ribbon in half and then cut away both ends at an angle. I did this for all my ribbons with the exception of the silver trim. I just left those ends straight. These are the selection of 12-inch ribbons that I'm using on my tree. I pushed the branches up to move them out of the way. I'm starting with the poinsettia ribbon. I'm making sure the two ends are even, and then I'm tying it in a knot around the base. I'm sliding it down to the bottom and now adding on the white sheer ribbon. I'm once again making sure the ends match and then tying it into a knot. Now, if you're not perfect with your ends, not to worry, because once the tree's together, you won't even notice. I'm adding on the silver trim and I'm making sure to push the ribbons down so there's room for the next ribbon. I'm now adding on my red and white polka dot, and I'm finishing up with the Dollar Tree Merry Christmas ribbon. With these in place, I'm now separating the next section of branches to add my ribbons. These ribbons are 14-inch ribbons, and I'm starting with the red and green plaid. I'm adding on the white sheer ribbon, and once again, I'm just making a knot and tying them on the tree. I'm now adding the poinsettia, silver, making sure to push them down as I go, the red and white polka dot. I'm now attaching the silver trim, and when I'm done, I'm going to finish up by adding on the Merry Christmas Dollar Tree ribbon. It's time to add on my next set of ribbons, so once again, I'm separating the next group of branches. These are 14-inch ribbons that I'm using for this section, and I'm starting off with my poinsettia. I'm now adding on the silver trim and then the red and white polka dot. I'm following that with the silver ribbon and the red and green plaid. The next ribbon I'm adding on is the Christmas stripe ribbon. Now, I only had enough to cut two 12-inch ribbons, so I'm just adding one of them on here. And now I'm finishing up with that Dollar Tree Merry Christmas ribbon. With those in place, I'm now separating the next set of branches. I chose these 12-inch ribbons to add onto my tree, and I'm starting off with the white sheer ribbon. Next is the red and green Christmas plaid, then the silver trim, and the red and white polka dot ribbon. I'm now adding on the silver ribbon, the red sheer ribbon, and I'm finishing up with that Merry Christmas Dollar Tree ribbon. Now that I'm done, I'm folding down the last small section of branches. I'm adding on my last 12-inch ribbons, and I'm starting with the silver. I'm now adding on the red and green plaid, and then the red and white polka dot ribbon. I'm now finally finishing adding my ribbons on with the white sheer and finishing up with the Christmas striped ribbon. It certainly looks really messy, but now I'm going to start bending out and down the branches on the tree. I started at the bottom and worked my way up to the top. Now, there's not a whole bunch of them, and so I made sure that most of the branches were in the front, but I did pull some of them into the back. With my branches now in place, I'm neatening up the ribbons. I'm just kind of moving them around, opening up the wired ribbons, and bending them and pulling them all in a downward pattern. If you find that some of the ribbons look a bit too long and out of place, just use your scissors and give them a little trim. For that one tall branch that's on the top, I just folded it over onto the back. To stand the tree up, you can use the base that came with it, but I'm going to make my own. I'm using one of the small terracotta flower pots from the Dollar Tree, and I'm painting it brown with the Dollar Tree acrylic paint. There's a little hole in the bottom and I don't want the hot glue to sneak out. So I placed it down on a piece of white paper and I traced around it. I then used my scissors to cut it out. I then placed it in the bottom of the flower pot and added some hot glue onto the top. And now I'm adding in some E6000. The hot glue will help hold it in place while the E6000 sets up. I'm now placing the bottom of the tree into my pot. To balance my tree, I'm using a handful of glass beads, and you can pick these up at the Dollar Tree. And all I did was add them evenly around the inside of the pot. I'm adding a wooden star to the top of my tree. I picked this up at the Dollar Tree and it came in a pack with 3 different shapes. You can choose any color to paint it, but I decided to paint mine with some bright yellow acrylic paint. And I also made sure to paint both sides. Now that it's dry, I'm going to give it a bit of a vintage appearance by using a pencil. I'm rubbing my pencil on the outside edges of the star, and when I'm done, I'm using my finger and just kind of rubbing it in. It tones down the star, gives it a bit of dimension, and that rustic vintage appearance. To finish my Christmas tree, I'm adding some hot glue to the top and attaching the star. And my Christmas ribbon tree is complete. For my farmhouse snowman, I'm using one of the mason jar shaped signs from the Dollar Tree. The front graphic on mine was starting to peel off, so I just used my blade to help remove the rest of it. When I was done, I then removed the jute accent that they had wrapped around the top, and I also removed the labels that were on the back by heating them up with my hairdryer. To make the front nice and smooth, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree sand blocks to remove any of the excess paper. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes it's nice to have a friend to craft with, so our cat Sammy came over and he was just kind of helping me out. To add on a base and where I'll be attaching the scarf, I'm using 8 of the Dollar Tree's tumbling tower blocks. I'm using my Starbond thick glue, and you all know how much I love this because it sets natural wood up in about a minute or 2, and I have that linked below in case you'd like to check it out. I'm adding it to the blocks, and I'm attaching 2 sets of 4 blocks together. Now that they've set up, and it takes just about a minute or 2, I'm adding some of my Starbond glue to the bottom of the mason jar and centering it on the base. Now that I have both pieces attached, I'm using some white acrylic paint and giving it a complete coat. With the paint dry, it's now time to add on the top hat. I'm using a leftover piece of 3" by 3" wood plank from the Dollar Tree. I used the original piece in my gingerbread house, and I'll have that video linked below in case you'd like to check it out. I'm using an old piece of sandpaper and just kind of rounding off the 2 top corners. This step is completely optional, and if you prefer pointy corners, just skip this step. For the hat's brim, I'm using a large craft stick, and I'm going to cut it at 6 inches in length, and it's 1.5 inches wide. I cut off the round ends, I measured it to 6 inches, and then I cut it. To find the placement, I added the square piece of wood and the craft stick onto the top of my mason jar, then drew a line across where I wanted to attach them. I then glued both pieces together with my Star Bond glue. I'm going to be adding on some really simple eyes, and I found this package of assorted size wooden circles at Michael's. I gave both the hat and the eyes a coat of black acrylic paint. Now, while those are drying, I'm going to make the carrot nose for my snowman. I'm using one of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree, and if you don't want to do this, you can always cut out a carrot-shaped nose from your craft stick. I'm using a coarse grit sandpaper, and I'm using a little muscle and sanding down those sides. As I'm sanding down the sides, I'm rounding the end of the wood so it resembles a carrot. I made these same noses for some snowmen in a past video, and I'll have that linked below in case you'd like to check them out. Now that I'm finished, I used some of the Dollar Tree orange acrylic paint and I gave it a coat. I want to give my snowman a bit of a rustic vibe, so I'm using an old piece of sandpaper and I'm just sanding down the edges. When that was complete, I then used the same sandpaper and sanded down the edges of the hat. With that done, I then finished up with the carrot. To make the snowman's eyes, I'm using some white acrylic paint. I placed a dot on the end of my paintbrush and then painted the dot in the same place on both eyes. With the eyes dry, I then ran the sandpaper around the outside edge. I want to accent the hat, so I'm using the same white paint in the end of the paintbrush and adding on a whole bunch of random dots. Now that I'm done, you all know how much I love to splatter, so I took a wet paintbrush with a little bit of acrylic paint, and then using my second paintbrush, I just tapped the paint onto the hat. With all the pieces for my snowman complete, I can now put him together. I used my glue gun to attach the hat. I then attached the eyes. With those all in place, I'm now attaching the carrot nose. I used my paint pen and added on some eyebrows and some eyelashes. I then drew on his mouth. To add on some little cheeks, I'm using 2 of the smaller circles that were in that assorted package, and I'm painting them with my coral acrylic paint. When they were dry, I then attached one to each end of his smile. With all the pieces in place, I'm giving him a complete coat with my satin Mod Podge. To add on the snowman scarf, I'm using a piece of 1.5-inch buffalo check ribbon, and I had picked this up at Michael's. I added some hot glue around the base that I had added and attached the ribbon. I tucked the ribbon around the top and on the bottom. I cut a short piece of ribbon, glued it in half, and then attached it onto the bottom. To make the top of the scarf, I'm using the same ribbon and I'm just making a simple bow. When I was done, I then clipped the end off at an angle. I then added some hot glue to the corner and attached my bow. To accent my scarf, I'm using one of these red sparkly stars that I had picked up at the Dollar Tree. I added on a dot of hot glue and attached it in the center. I'm cutting a piece of this buffalo check ribbon and adding it onto the brim as an accent. Once the ribbon was in place on the front, I then attached the ends on the back. To embellish the hat, I'm using some leftover green leaves and some berries, along with a snowflake that came from the Dollar Tree. If you prefer not to layer on some greenery, you can always just add on a snowflake. After everything was added to the hat, and this next step is completely optional, I did take my white paint pen and I just kind of ran it around the outside edges of the leaves to give them a snowy accent. To finish up, I'm using some red ribbon to make the hanger. I cut about 18 inches and then I knotted it together on one end. I then added some hot glue to the back and attached my hanger. I hot glued a shorter piece of the same ribbon across the knot to give it some extra support. I'm starting this DIY by using one of the wooden cutouts from the Dollar Tree, and I'm giving it a coat of white acrylic paint. I chose white for my star, but I think any of the holiday colors would look great too. For the center accent, I removed the tag and I'm using one of these gold stars from the Dollar Tree. I'm going to be adding my two stars together, but before I do, I'm going to attach the hanger. Each star has a hole in it, so I'm matching the two up together. For the hanger, I'm using a piece of white ribbon and I'm sliding it through the gold and the white star. And I'm waiting until later to tie them off. I'm attaching the two stars together using my E6000. I turned the gold one over and added the glue to the flat sides of the star. When I was done, I then centered it on the white star. I'm adding on some accents and I'm using one piece of this wired greenery from the Dollar Tree. I folded it into thirds and snipped off the folded ends. I added some hot glue to the center of the gold star and then attached the little bunch. I'm using one of the flower stems from this Dollar Tree holly, and it comes with 3 leaves and some red berries. I snipped off one bunch and hot glued it to the center of the greenery. I want to give the holly a bit of a snowy effect, so I'm using my white acrylic paint, and with my paintbrush, I'm adding a light coat of paint around the outside edges of the leaves. I'm now adding on some additional accents, and I'm using 2 of these small pine cones. They actually came in a package from the Dollar Tree. I used my glue gun and attached one on the side and one on the top. For the accent bow, I'm using this pretty Christmas ribbon that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. And I'm also using a piece of floral wire. I only need a half piece of floral wire, so I just folded it in half and cut it. To make the bow, I gave myself about a 3-inch tail and a 3-inch loop. I then twisted the ribbon and made myself another 3-inch loop. Then I secured the bow together with my floral wire. I placed it over the center of the bow, pulled tightly and twisted it together. I then cut the ribbon, giving both tails an angled end. I added some hot glue to the side of the holly and then attached my bow. For my final accent, I'm using the red and the gold berry garland from the Dollar Tree. I cut 4 pieces at about 4 inches in length. I then randomly added them around the center of the star. When I was happy with their placement, I then used my hot glue gun to secure them. To finish up, I tied a little knot in the hanger. And with that, this Christmas star is ready for the holidays. To start my Christmas pine cone tree, I'm using one of these large pine cones from this bag of cinnamon pine cones that I picked up at my grocery store. As long as your pine cone will sit flat, you can use any style or size that you have on hand. I made sure the bottom of my pine cone will sit flat, and now I'm adding on a snowy accent. I added some white acrylic paint to the end of my paintbrush, and all I'm doing is adding some on the top and the bottom of each scale on the pine cone. While I was adding it on, I wasn't super fussy. I just kind of added it here and there so that it looked like snow. Now that it's dry, I'm going to be adding on an accent, and I'm using this mini Christmas bell garland that I picked up at the Dollar Tree. I couldn't find any mini Christmas bells at my Dollar Tree, so I'm using my clippers and snipping them off. With my bells in hand, I'm now going to attach them to the pine cone. I'm simply using my hot glue gun, adding a dot of hot glue here and there randomly around the cone, and placing down my red and green bells. You can add a different colored bell to each scale if you'd like. I didn't have enough, and I thought it was kind of overwhelming if I added too many, so I just added what was on the garland. For my pine cone Christmas tree base, I'm using one of these round wooden discs that I already had on hand. Now, if you don't have anything like this, you can always use one of the Dollar Tree sliced wood ornaments, and that will work great too. For the star on top of my Christmas tree, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree wooden stars, and using my white acrylic paint, I'm giving that and the base a coat. I chose to use my white acrylic paint, but you can paint yours any colors at all. With them both dry, I'm going to decorate the base by using some of this Dollar Tree Christmas striped ribbon. I added some hot glue in the center and then just attached the ribbon around the base. To add my pine cone onto the base, I'm using a good amount of hot glue and then holding it in place. I'm adding my star accent to the top by simply placing on a dot of hot glue and attaching it. I'm adding on 2 sprigs of greenery as a final accent, and these are just left over from some Dollar Tree picks. I used my glue gun and just attached them behind the star. And with that, this cute pine cone Christmas tree is ready for my tiered tray. Getting started, I'm using 2 of the oversized foam dice from the Dollar Tree. I'm going to be painting them, and to make it easier, I'm using 2 of the wooden skewers from the Dollar Tree, and I'm pushing 1 into each side of the dice. With those in place, I'm now using my white acrylic paint and giving each 2 coats. After my 2 coats of paint dried, I then removed them from the skewers. I'm going to make sure that the 2 holes on the dice are facing each other. I'm attaching a 2 and a 5 to the dice for Christmas Day, and I'm using the 2 and the 5 from this Dollar Tree poster number pack. I simply removed them and placed one on each block. With my numbers in place, I'm going to attach them together with some hot glue, making sure that the sides with the 2 holes match up together. I want to break that bright white up just a bit, so I'm going to splatter the dice with my green and red acrylic paint. I'm starting with the red, and I'm just placing a little bit on the end of my paintbrush, and then using another paintbrush, I'm tapping it all around the 2 dice. I'm giving it a light coat, and when I'm done tapping the top, the back, and the sides, I'm tapping on the front with the 25. When the red was complete, I then moved on to the green and followed the same instructions. I'm adding on a ribbon accent, and I'm using this pretty 5/8 of an inch holly ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I measured it around the dice blocks and then cut 2 pieces. I then used my glue gun to attach one around the front and one around the back. Adding on the red and green paint splatter along with these ribbon accents for this project, they're just personal preference and they're completely optional. Dollar Tree has an assortment of Christmas ornaments that you can use to decorate your 25 blocks. I picked out this red Christmas sleigh, and I'm going to use this along with 3 of these little gifts from the Dollar Tree. I picked out the silver, the gold, and the red, and I'm adding them into the back of the sleigh. I'm placing some hot glue in the bottom, then placing in the gold gift. I'm now hot gluing in the silver and then the red. To pull Santa's sleigh, I need a reindeer, and I'm using one of these white ornament reindeers from the Dollar Tree. He's wearing a scarf, so to bring in a little color, I'm painting it with my green acrylic paint. With the scarf complete, I'm now using some of the brown Dollar Tree acrylic paint, and I'm painting his antlers. With my reindeer and sleigh complete, I'm using some E6000 to attach them to the blocks. I placed a generous amount on the bottom of the sleigh runners and then placed it on top of the blocks. I then attached some to the bottom of the reindeer's hooves and placed his tail in between that little opening on the sleigh. What's Christmas without Santa? I'm adding one that I already had on hand. He actually came from the Goodwill in a big bag of goodies. You can find similar ornaments like him at Michael's, Joann's, the Dollar Tree, and even Walmart. To add him, I'm placing a little dot of hot glue on his hand and then have him leaning against the blocks. I can't wait to place this in front of my Christmas tiered tray. To make my gnome holder, I'm using one of these gnomes from the Dollar Tree. It was meant to be a yardstick, but the post snapped off. So I'm turning it over, removing the rest of the post and the sticker label. My gnome's going to be standing up, so I need to remove those little ends of his beard. I just used my clippers and snipped them off. To stabilize my gnome, I'm using 5 of the tumbling tower blocks from the Dollar Tree. I'm attaching 2 together using my hot glue gun. To help him stand up, I'm then attaching each one onto the back. Once I found their placement, I then attached them with some hot glue. I'm using the 5th tumbling tower block as a stabilizer, and I'm giving that, along with the back of the gnome, a coat of white acrylic paint. While that's drying, I'm going to be using one of the Dollar Tree wooden craft boxes. I'm going to be stacking the two pieces, and I'm giving the lid a coat of red acrylic paint. When that's complete, I'm now using my white acrylic paint and I'm painting the box. Once both pieces have completely dried, I'm attaching them together. I'm placing some hot glue on the top lid. I'm then centering the white box on the lid, open side up. I'm adding a ribbon accent to the box, and I'm using this Christmas striped ribbon from the Dollar Tree. I wrapped the ribbon around the box and then cut it to size. I then added some hot glue to the four sides of the box and attached it. I'm adding a bow accent to the front, and I'm using the same Dollar Tree ribbon and making a simple bow. To attach it, I placed some hot glue in the center of the ribbon and then just popped it into place. As an accent on the box, I'm using one of these candy cane wooden stickers from the Dollar Tree, and I painted it in the classic candy cane colors. I placed some hot glue in the center of the bow and attached the candy canes. On the back of the box, I'm adding on some hot glue and attaching the painted tumbling tower block. I'm now adding some hot glue onto that and pressing the gnome and the box together. I'm using mine in two different ways. At first, I'm adding in some candy. And the second way, I'm going to turn it into an LED candle holder. I'm using a small glass jar, and you can find similar items at the Dollar Tree. I'm using a piece of wired greenery, and I picked this up at the Dollar Tree as well. I wrapped it around the top of the glass and twisted it together in the back. And now it's as easy as just placing it in the box. To add a pop of color, I'm using 4 of these frosted red berries from the Dollar Tree, and I'm placing one in each corner. To finish up, I'm using one of the Dollar Tree LED candles, and be sure not to use a live flame in this project. I placed it on, added it into the candle jar, and with that, this gnome project is complete. To make my Christmas tiered tray birdhouse, I'm starting with one of the little wooden birdhouses from the Dollar Tree. I'm making a base for it, and I'm using 8 of the Dollar Tree's tumbling tower blocks. I'm attaching them using my glue gun, and I'm placing 4 on the bottom and 4 on the top. Now that they're all attached together, I have a little base for my birdhouse. And to attach the two together, I'm placing some hot glue on the top of the base and then centering down the birdhouse. For this project, you can paint your birdhouse any color you'd like. I'm going to paint mine with some white acrylic paint. I'm adding a roof onto this craft, so I'm not going to paint it. I'm going to add some Christmas ornaments and a wreath onto the birdhouse, and if you follow me, you know how much I love to use those Mardi Gras beads. I'm getting started by cutting individual beads off the different colored necklaces. I'm first making my wreath, and I'm using 1 piece of greenery from this Dollar Tree wired garland pack. I'm folding it in half and cutting it with my clippers. Because it's wired, it's easy to bend, so I'm making a small circle and then wrapping the ends over the garland. With my wreath made, I'm now going to check the size over the opening on the birdhouse. The fit is perfect, so I'm going to clean it up using my scissors. To add the beads onto my wreath, I'm just placing some dots of hot glue and then placing down a different colored bead. I've made a bunch of these for different projects. They're easy and they make really cute accents. To decorate the birdhouse, I'm placing a line of hot glue against the edge of the house and then just placing down some of the beads. As I was adding them, I didn't have a pattern. I just placed the colors on randomly. I worked my way around the front, the two sides, and the back. Before I add on the wreath, I'm going to make a roof for the birdhouse, and I absolutely love using these Dollar Tree wooden clothespins. I need 14 pieces, so I'm pulling apart 7 of them. I've separated them into 2 sets of 7, and I'm going to use my Starbond thick glue to attach them together. I love working with this glue because it sets natural wood up in just a couple of minutes. And if you'd like to try it, I do have the company linked below. To attach them together, I'm using my Starbond glue and laying them side by side. I'm also making sure that the flat ends line up evenly. Now that the glue has dried, I'm going to paint both sides using this pretty golden brown acrylic paint. While I'm painting, I'm making sure to get inside all those little nooks and crannies. Now that my roof is dry, I'm attaching it to the top of the birdhouse using my hot glue gun. I placed some hot glue on one side and then placed the top of the roof on the peak of the birdhouse. I then did the same for the other side. I'm painting the peak on the birdhouse the same golden brown paint to match the roof. To add on the wreath, I'm placing some hot glue on the back and then centering it over the opening on the birdhouse. I'm adding a little pine cone accent to the base of the birdhouse, and I found these at the Dollar Tree. I used my hot glue gun to attach them. I'm adding a star accent to the top of my birdhouse, and I'm using one of these wooden stars from the Dollar Tree, and I painted mine green. I used my hot glue gun to attach it. Every birdhouse needs a bird, and I'm using this little red one from a package that I found at Michael's. I used my hot glue gun and attached him to the corner of the star. And with that, my Christmas tiered tray birdhouse is complete. Here we are at the end of the video, and I hope I inspired you to make some holiday and winter decor for your home. I'll leave some additional ideas for you here and in my description. And if you're new to my channel and you're thinking, hey, I'd like to come back and hang out with her again, don't forget to click that little red subscribe button below. I hope you all have an amazing day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.